Are we managing to retain customers with that mind shift change? Have we struggled with that before? Are we doing, and again, this doesn't maybe necessarily have to be the fractional leader, but are we doing more to enable our existing customers to succeed by having certain types of video and therefore they're less likely to churn? Or are we able to accelerate the sales cycle? Are we bringing valuable information at particular stages of the buyer journey that actually helps accelerate that process?
If you want to have a brand that stands out, you've got to have something that is a little bit polarizing. So you've got to have your fans, diehard fans on one side, and you've got the other extreme of those who just, you're not their cup of tea, they don't like you at all. Because if you're a bit vanilla in the middle, you're just not going to stand out.
Make a start and don't wait for perfectionism. Because if you think about it, as much as we'd like to think that any video I upload to YouTube, everyone in the world will see, I can promise you they will not, sadly, because there is gigabytes and terabytes and whatever bytes going up on YouTube every day. Unless you are really at the forefront, the algorithm is not going to push you to everyone. So even if you aren't entirely happy with it and it is your first or second or fifth video and you do upload it because you want to have that exposure, you're still in the same place, because not everybody's going to see it.
Welcome to the Fractional Frontier, where we explore the future of leadership in today's evolving business landscape. I'm Lorraine Carter here with Charles McLaughlin, and every week we dive deep into the world of high-performing fractional executives and the businesses that leverage them.
Whether you're an experienced fractional leader or a business decision maker seeking top-tier talent, this is the place to be for actionable insights, strategies, and stories from the front lines of fractional leadership.
And today we're tackling a highly relevant topic: how fractional executives and SME business leaders can leverage video using a personality-led approach in a B2B context. And we're joined by Lev Cribb from Made to See, experts in video creation and live streaming for the B2B sector. Welcome, Lev. Can you start by sharing a little bit about your background and what led you to specialize in video creation and streaming for the B2B sector?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you, Charles. Thank you for having me on the podcast. My name is Lev Cribb. I'm the managing director and founder of Made to See. Thank you for the introduction. The way I got into this area really was a long time ago. Started out in digital communications. That started with programming websites back in '96, quite a long time ago. And then probably the most relevant portion of my career was when I joined On24, webinar platform and live streaming platform, back in 2009, and spent about 6-7 years there. But then started out with Made to See back in 2016. And if you think about it, video's never had a bad day since it started back in the 1800s. There's never been a dip in how popular video is. So I thought it's probably a good space to be in.
Killed the radio star, didn't it, Lev?
Pardon?
Video killed the radio star, didn't it?
Indeed, it did indeed. But then podcasts are still around, right?
But what are you brought you to this idea of personality-led as an approach for video in the B2B world, of all the other different things you could have done?
Well, I mean, it's one area, but we do consistently see that B2C trends lead the way and B2B follows. We see that in the adoption of technology. Think back to BlackBerry and iPhone, where they started and where they were popular first, and then who adopted what. But it's the same for video as well, video adoption, and ultimately also the style of videos. If you think about what is popular in the B2C space, or what perhaps started out maybe a couple of years ago, and we see that in B2B now as well. So that was quite it's quite a standard thing that we see. So we always look towards B2C and then think, okay, when or will that apply to B2B as well? And ultimately, I guess B2B is incredibly saturated with companies offering very similar things, and it becomes hard to have your USPs full stop or have your USPs stand out. So, a lot of it is around something that perhaps many companies offer. Maybe in your competitive space, there are 10, 20, perhaps hundreds of companies who offer a very similar thing, but in a slightly different wrapper. So having a personality-led approach can set you aside much more. And with that comes, opinions and different motivations of how you speak on video and what you share. So there's definitely a differentiator there that you can achieve that perhaps a product alone or a service offering alone might struggle with.
That's so valid, Lev. When I even reflect across all the different brands I've worked with, both B2B and B2C, you're absolutely right about how some of those strategies and thinkings from B2C then gradually translate into the B2B context. So from a fractional executive or SME business leaders perspective, they often struggle to stand out online, and as you've mentioned, even more so in such saturated markets. So from your perspective and experience, why is traditional B2B communication often so ineffective in building trust and visibility?
Yeah, I mean, if we think about what B2B offers, it's typically by its very nature a sort of corporation-led rather than a personality-led thing. It offers a product or a service, and building brand personality can be quite hard to achieve if you lead with that. So that's something that's this personality-led video approach can address, but ultimately the reason for that is because humans buy from humans, and there's that we rely on human interaction and human trust and that human experience that allows us to sell, which is why I guess salespeople are paid very highly if they do very well, because ultimately they're at the front line of that. I mean, if you think about, just to give you an example, if you think about your local high street, if you still have one, there might be 3 sandwich shops, and let's assume they all sell exactly the same sandwiches, exactly the same quality. The most successful one, and the one that you're most likely to go to or stay with, is where perhaps you have a relationship with a person, or you like the personality of the person behind the counter, because that stands out amongst all the old samey BLTs on the counter. So that is something that attracts, that's something that retains, and that's something that builds rapport. Now, what happens if that person behind the counter that you have this relationship with leaves to go to one of the other shops? You're likely to follow them because the sandwiches are all the same. You quite like that person. Unless there's other factors that come into it, you probably follow them and go to the other shop. And it can be the same for fractional leaders as well, in business as well. It's that personality that people relate to and that ultimately people then buy from as well.
So you've made out why this makes sense. I suppose I'm interested, what do you think stops so many high-level professionals from using video confidently and creatively representing themselves and their business to clients? What's holding them back, Lev?
Well, it can be varied, but it's rarely about budget. But there can be a whole host of different reasons for that. I mean, one is a lack of time. Just because leaders typically are in high demand, they've got a lot of responsibilities and things to do, and so they don't necessarily have the time to prepare or record even that kind of content. It could be a lack of knowledge on how to actually do that, even if they did have the time as well. But these competing priorities then tend to create that sort of thought around, well, if I can't get it right straight away, then I'd rather not do it, or I'd rather do it another time. With that, often, and I think perhaps it's slightly more in the nature of leaders as well, is this need for perfectionism. If I'm going to do this and it's going to represent my personal brand, I want this to be perfect. I want this to be right. So that can be another aspect. But then you've got potentially lack of confidence because you haven't done it before. And then, I suppose there is there's a mindset element as well, where you want this to be perfect, you want this to be right, and you want it to work straight away. But this is not just about doing one video. This is about a mindset of how you communicate online, how you present yourself online. So it could be that it's around a focus which kind of wraps all of those previous reasons together, and focus around a sort of short-term KPI or short-term result of, I want this to be right straight away, rather than this is a longer-term play, a longer-term mindset shift that actually then allows me to address the previous points we just addressed.
So if I think of the leader of Ryanair, he's used his personality to get what was reported towards the end of May, 100 million euro bonus. So it's working for him. Why can't it work for all of us?
Because I think in business it is hard to lead with opinions, isn't it? Because it puts us out there. It's and you know, the Ryan CEO does that very well. Whether everybody likes it is another question. But it is memorable, and you know, there is a certain self-consciousness about expressing opinions in a format perhaps that is recorded and on YouTube forever, pretty much. And you know, are we comfortable doing that? And actually, perhaps we're not confident in that opinion, or if we are, it might be too extreme, or you know, we want to moderate that a little bit. It could work for all of us, and whether we're comfortable with taking that approach is another question. So it's finding that balance on how we do that.
That actually raises a really important point, that all leaders, whether it's those who are working as fractional executives or SME decision makers, can actually reflect on. And that's whether we're talking about a personal brand or corporate entity, product or service brand. If you want to have a brand that stands out, you've got to have something that is a little bit polarizing. So you've got to have your fans, diehard fans on one side, and you've got the other extreme of those who just, you're not their cup of tea, they don't like you at all. Because if you're a bit vanilla in the middle, you're just not going to stand out. So engaging with video does require, and doing it successfully, putting yourself forward, because there's multiple other leaders we can think of who are the voices for their brand, and they are controversial to different degrees. You can think of like, and I'm going to just mention ones here that will be universally known, like say if we go to Steve Jobs or Kim Kardashian or Elon Musk. They're the voices behind their brands, and they have as much as their lovers as their haters. So if you take a very unique approach, Lev, using personality and character-based narratives to tell those strong business stories. What's the psychology behind that, in addition to perhaps what I've shared, and why does it work so well in that B2B context?
Yeah. It's funny that you should mention these leaders, because it reminded me of a quote in one of my favorite movies, Braveheart. If you've watched it, there's a quote saying that uncompromising men or people are easy to admire. And then the narrative continues in the movie but ultimately it's also about survival. It is easy to admire somebody who's got strong opinions, who's out there, who's controversial, and it is memorable. But also that has to be sustainable. And you know, the Ryanair boss has done that successfully for some time, and others as well. But we're not necessarily those people. So that's one aspect. But ultimately, it comes back to the kind of the human and trust element, and that balance a little bit as well, where our brains, if you think about psychologically, or perhaps even DNA gene wise, our brains are wired to react and remember stories. You know, that's from evolution. It's, you know, it's how before we invented writing, things got passed along through stories. But also the brain is trained to recognize faces. That's why we see faces in cars, car bonnets, and so on. You know, it's we recognize shapes that seem to be a face. So combine those together. If you have a storytelling element on video, those are elements that we remember, that we react to, that we empathize with, or perhaps shirk back from if it's too controversial. But ultimately, psychologically, that's what helps us. And there are studies around, you know, what is most memorable if you say something and only hear it audibly. Some people might be listening to this, you know, as podcast as an audio version, or does it become more memorable when it's audio and video, or is it elements that add visually anything to it as well, and that could be also visually in our minds as a story, for example. And the more of those things there are, the more relatable and the more memorable that becomes. Ultimately, it's part of evolution.
So what kinds of results have you seen when your clients switch from sort of generic corporate video to something more relatable and more personality driven?
So I mean, generally, otherwise we wouldn't be doing it. We see good results. It's got to be in the right setting, and it's got to be done correctly as well. I'll give you an example where for one of our clients, there's a very large webinar program that we developed for them, and as that webinar program grew, obviously it's a video webinar program. We started diversifying their formats. What kind of webinars and in what format they would run. And your typical webinar that you're used to will be, a presentation slide deck. There'll be a presentation around why XYZ product is better than everybody else's and how it works. There might be a little bit of a demo as well, a screen share, and then there's a Q&A. That's your sort of standard format. I'm not saying that's necessarily the best one or the most memorable one, but that's what we see most of. And as we started developing this program, we started introducing something that would work better further down the funnel, in the sense of anybody who's getting more ready to buy, that doesn't just need the actual factual information to begin with. What do they react to better? So we developed this format, an Ask the Expert format, where there was absolutely no slideware. And we asked registrants and attendees to pre-submit questions as they registered. We announced what the topic was, and it would be a topic that people generally would have an interest in and that we knew would garner questions. And then we would get all these questions, we'd pre-prepare them, and we'd allow for live questions during the webinar as well. And then the expert, all they would do is answer the questions from the audience. They wouldn't lead with any predefined agenda other than what the topic was, and they would answer the questions. And where appropriate, they might do a little screen share just to illustrate the point. And what we noticed after we started running these was, because it was a personality-led piece, yes, it was live streaming video, but it's still video. What we started noticing, and the feedback we were getting in the survey results afterwards, was this was great. And we had, at this point, we had about 60 questions or so, which for a sort of 45, 60-minute webinar was great. The feedback was, this was great, but we could have done this for longer. I've got more questions. Can you please next time make it longer? Now, if you are in conversations around webinars, often the question we get asked is, do we have to do it for an hour? Can we just do like bite-sized type stuff? Can we do 20, 30 minutes instead? And so the questions that came in was like, can we do more than 60 minutes next time? Because, and this is from the audience. So, okay, great. We'll do it for 90 minutes next time. And we got more questions, and they responded. And a lot of the questions came around what the expert would explain. That would trigger more questions and more interest as well. We saw an increase in attendance over time for each next webinar, and these requests of, well, can we do this for longer, grew to 90 minutes. And even at 90 minutes, people were saying, this is so good, I could happily sit here for an extra 30 minutes. So we never got that kind of feedback on a sort of slide deck led type webinar. And I think that's where we see these results kind of really pay dividends in terms of how that works. And to give you sort of very brief other example, I mean, we see a lot of employee-generated content, and in the same organization that I just mentioned, there was a gentleman who is very good at talking about his work from a sort of personal perspective, but it's still work-related, and puts videos out there, whether they go to a conference, whether they go to a client meeting. They almost sort of create a sort of a narrative of their days or their week on key highlights and post that to LinkedIn. They've built a huge personal brand around that, a huge following, and they get a lot of engagement from that. They don't talk about themselves, they talk about what they do for work, but they're very passionate about that, and that leads with personality.
So that's really interesting, Lev, in terms of where things have moved from. And it almost sounds like you were ahead of the curve, because things have moved so fast, and you're organically and very dynamically were engaging with your audience, which is a bit like, say, some of the live feeds you might see now on X, where you will have live transmission and you have very dynamic audience engagement. So I guess one of the questions I have from a business context again then is, how do you balance that humanity, professionalism, and perhaps humor, especially for fractional leaders and business decision makers who are working in very serious, traditional, formal, or technical fields?
Yeah, I mean, humor is a bit of a minefield, and it should certainly never be scripted. Because I mean, if just think back to the last Best Man speech you heard, whether that was at an actual wedding you went to or on a YouTube video, it's very easy to tell if somebody's tried to script it and then there's a tumbleweed moment and actually it's really awkward, or if it's actually somebody who's delivered something naturally, funnily because that's how they are and that's their personality. So don't try and sort of force humor into that space. It doesn't mean that it's not valuable, because if it is part of your personality, or you can develop that, and it's not something that we're all born with, but certainly think something that we can develop. There's no reason not to use it if it's done appropriately. There's a very clever man called Vin Jiang, who's a sort of public speaking coach, does all kinds of corporate events as well, but is very prevalent on YouTube as well. And he explains that humor lives at the intersection between the benign and violation. And there's this Venn diagram, and in the middle there's a sort of overlap. We say something benign or make a joke that is benign and that gets an eye roll, here we go again. And then you say something that sort of strays into the sort of violation space, and then everybody's like, oh, that's really uncomfortable and creepy. I don't really want to engage with that kind of conversation. And then there's this intersection where that sort of you're sort of sailing very close to the wind, and that's where all of a sudden, like, oh, that was actually quite funny, and that's getting that right is not easy. And if it doesn't come naturally to you, then you stray on the sort of the benign area rather than the violation area. So that balance is really important to find and strike, and stay away from if you're not comfortable. But ultimately, failure is human, and we all get it wrong sometimes, and whether that's with humor or whether it's with other things. And there might be some inappropriate joke we've told where we realize, that wasn't actually quite right for this audience, or shouldn't have been told at all, for any kind of audience. But we fail, and that is human. But it's also human to be then empathetic. If you say something wrong, I say something wrong, I rely on the fact that my human peers will be like, oh, okay, well, yeah, maybe that wasn't the right thing to say, but okay, let's move on. And there's a level of empathy, and ultimately that shows, when we fail, vulnerability. And it shows personality, and it shows who we are, and it gives a bit of a peek behind the kind of screen of perhaps the kind of corporate me, and gives me or gives others an insight into actually who I am. And hopefully I've done that appropriately, so that people think I was funny or kind of informative or professional, rather than thinking that was either too benign, that I was totally bored out of my brains, or it was entirely inappropriate and I don't want to listen to this person ever again. So it's finding this balance. If you do that, and if you think about the fractional leaders, bringing your personality into video is really important, because ultimately people will want to work with you, and you will want to have a good relationship with them, and it should last. And actually, especially if you're a fractional leader, it might be that you want to work for other companies as well, or there's a progression path. So it's finding that balance, but just being mindful of how can you be human, how can you be professional, but how can you show some of your personality as well?
You're reminding me of a preacher that I came across, and before he preached, you get up on the stage, and before he said anything else, he would read out 3 mildly embarrassing jokes from a joke book. He didn't claim they were his, just sort of read them out from the joke book. And because he did this every single time, the audience were waiting for it, and they would sort of laugh to share his own personal embarrassment. But it was the consistency that did it. It wasn't the quality of the jokes. There might be mother-in-law jokes or something mildly inappropriate, but he would confidently speak these jokes consistently, and then his audience expected it. And I think they would have felt shortchanged if he didn't tell these 3 dreadful jokes at the beginning of his preach.
It's a nice icebreaker, isn't it, as well? And actually, it sets the bar very low, and anything that comes above that is welcome.
And he made it a key part of his personality as well.
Yeah, well, there you
But
go.
let's go the practical for a fractional executive, or a business leader who's going to go into this video space. I'm particularly interested in, how would you use it to engage your current customers or your current clients? What kinds of approaches would you take there?
Well, if you think about what personality-led video replaces, it's factual, sort of PowerPoint-led information, technical, financial insights, that kind of thing. And that typically is presented from a sort of corporate setting, you know, if you're on video. But if you think about what the kind of the personality-led videos that you may have seen, that you come across, that you perhaps before today, before listening to this, weren't even aware, oh, that was a thing, and actually, yes, that was personality-led. The ones that you remember, whether that was on YouTube or Facebook or wherever else, the ones that stand out would be from people, if you're looking at a business context, of somebody who was perhaps just at a conference, who just sat down in the kind of lounge area and just put their phone on and just records their sort of thoughts and their impressions, their highlights. It could be, we've all seen them, the person walking their dog and they're filming themselves. Whether we like that format or not is another question, but those are memorable because it leads with personality. And you know, if you think about slightly more corporate setting, there could be a customer testimonial video as well, where we just film somebody else actually. So that employee generated content space is growing massively. I mentioned that earlier example, and it appeals because it is personal. It's not just corporate. And to give you an example to answer your question around how that works in attracting perhaps or retaining customers or attracting new ones, there was the CEO of a company that we work with. They were going out with an RFP for an existing client to retain their business. It was their largest client, and the RFP response would typically be, you know, reams of information, backgrounds on SLAs and pricing and all that kind of thing. But they said, well, actually, we want to do this slightly differently. We want to record the CEO speaking to camera about his passion for this customer relationship, how far they've come over time, and what he's willing to invest into that relationship to make this work. It's not just serve the next however many years of customer contractual obligations, but actually invest into their particular business that will then ultimately serve their customer business more as well. And that was a sort of 3-minute video. They took the time to record it, prepare it, speak personally. It wasn't just something generic that they use for all RFPs. And guess what the result was? They retained the client, and it was very much appreciated that the CEO took the time to do that and actually showed that relationship as well, that one, they were aware, it's a very large business, one, that they were aware of that business, that client, but also what the value was, because they spoke from the heart. So I think that's something that nicely visualizes how powerful that can be.
And then if we're looking at, which is as much relevant for fractional executives as it is for business owners, what type of formats, because that's a great story that you've shared about retaining an existing client, and I'm sure everybody listening could immediately think about how they could do that amongst their existing client base. But what about for attracting, what kind of types of formats or content themes do you think work best when you want to attract new clients or customers to best establish trust and authority as a fractional leader or as an SME business leader?
I think it depends a little bit on the personality, on their confidence. Coming back to the original points around, what am I comfortable with at this stage of my career or my experience with video, and going too far can make us too uncomfortable. So the right answer is not, I'm going to give you a specific format. The right answer is what is right for you, that you're comfortable with, that you feel comfortable with doing on an ongoing basis, or that you're comfortable with starting and developing. But generally, it is harder to present a formal piece because either you have to know really, really well to deliver it really well. And we have the benefit here, for example, yes, we are recording this episode, but there is, because it's long form, there is space for me to occasionally and ah, pause, think. If you're recording a 2-minute, 3-minute video or a 60-second video, you don't have that luxury. It has to be right. Otherwise, it becomes a little bit too lax, and actually you lose too much time. So do what you're comfortable with. whether that is filming yourself while you're walking the dog, whether it's filming yourself on your webcam sat at your desk, but more likely, and it might take a little bit more effort, more likely is that something conversational is easier to achieve to begin with. So that could be a conversation with another person. It could be somebody interviewing you. It could be interviewing somebody else, because that comes down to what we're doing here. Again, talk about sort of human interaction is much more relatable, and actually it's easier to deliver. So that's the guidance I would give, because ultimately from a standing start, it can be very hard to get everything right if you're focusing on particular formats.
Very interesting. I suppose that helps me to understand how somebody might start if they're at ground zero. Personally, I have massively resisted my social media experts' desire for me to constantly record bits of video, put it on Instagram, put it on TikTok. I've said, don't want to do any of that. So if you're somebody who has got that ultimate camera shy attitude, what is the very smallest thing that they could do that might move them in the direction and give them a little bit of confidence?
Well, first of all, is get started, because that's often the biggest hurdle. Is you're waiting for perfection, and you think, well, I need to watch all of the YouTube videos in the world to try and get this right. And the more you watch, the more opinions you'll get. So it ultimately has to fit your personality, and you have to get started. And it doesn't mean that what you record, you have to publish. Just because you recorded it doesn't mean that okay, well, now I have to publish it to YouTube or TikTok or wherever else. You can just keep it in your back pocket and think, okay, well, I've recorded that, and now I'll record the next one. And they might never see the light of day until you're actually at a point where you're comfortable. And you think, actually, you know what, this one, yes, I'm really happy with this. I feel good about this one. And that might be your second, it might be your first, it might be your 20th video that you recorded. And it all comes down to kind of rehearsing that a little bit and getting to a point where you think, actually, no, this is right. It'll give you confidence as well if you are speaking, for example, on a fireside chat or at an event. Just use that to publish that, and you can take that and create highlight clips from that and slice things out. The top highlights, 30-second sections, and there might be 4 or 5 of those, and put that online. And actually watching yourself back, even though that you might hate that, because actually everybody hates watching themselves back and listening to themselves, can be terrifying. But the more you do it, the better you become, because you become more used to criticizing yourself in a constructive way and learning from that. And that ultimately is, I think, a way that you can start progressing into something that you initially aren't comfortable with at all.
And do you think it's easier to start with somebody on the other side of the camera, that you're talking to a live person, or is that just more intimidating?
I think generally speaking, yes. There are different ways to approach it. One is you can imagine somebody else on the other side. Just the mindset of, I'm going to explain this to, you might know the rubber duck principle. Have a little rubber ducky on the top of your screen, and you just explain it to the rubber duck. And in fact, sometimes when I try and think of something that I was trying to work out, talk to the rubber duck, and actually just by expressing it and talking through it, then makes me think about it properly. So it could be that. It could be just an imaginary person behind a lens, if that helps you. Or it could be your spouse, your partner, a friend, a colleague, who literally stands behind the camera and you explain it to them. You might be self-conscious about that. If I do that with my wife, then she typically rolls her eyes, because she feels I talk differently in a business setting than I do at home. So she's like, oh, this is awful. I don't like listening to this. Do it with somebody else. So there are various different ways of doing it. But whatever helps for you in your setting, your personality, just try it out. And don't be shy to try different things, because ultimately nobody else is watching other than perhaps that one person or the rubber duck.
That's great advice, Lev. So it actually then makes me reflect on the fact that sometimes fractional executives and business leaders actually need to help their clients or customers communicate very complex messages too. So how can they use personality videos to help simplify complex factors or issues or messages and humanize that technical or abstract concept to communicate it in a way that's really effective and lands appropriately with their target audience?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, the reason for doing that is to make the brand more human, because it can very easily be hidden behind a website, behind slides, behind corporate talk tracks. Doing that, giving it more of a human face, already helps, because again, as what we said before, people react to human delivery, human experiences. But when it comes to different types of areas or complexities, there are different ways of explaining complex subject matters that don't have to necessarily be in a quick 90-second video format. And it doesn't just have to be one person to camera. It may not even have to be the fractional leader, but the fractional leader perhaps endorses it in a way. So if you think about an interview, a panel discussion, the Ask the Expert, there are different ways that we can communicate very complex situations that is still personality led, but perhaps not in the way we interpret the term, in the sense of it's a talking head, one person to camera for 90 seconds. Yes, that would be very difficult to explain complex situations, but you can break it up, and especially in conversation, things come out and can actually you can play with that format to bring out certain elements a bit more. You can either pre-script certain questions, and that's perfectly valid, especially in a panel discussion. That's very commonplace. But you can then also obviously bring in the audience, as we did, for example, with the Ask the Expert situation, where we get the real questions, the real areas of interest. Because if you think about every question from an audience member, either comes from an area of concern or an area of interest, but both are relevant. And when we did that, Ask the Expert format, there's actually a gentleman who flew over from the States to London. They were the product lead. They wanted to be on that as the expert because they developed the product. And when they came off that session and they saw all the questions, they said, I'm coming back. This is incredibly valuable, because what we're seeing is not just a conversation with a customer. We're not just presenting to them and getting a sort of polite, oh, that was really interesting. We get all these questions, and actually it guides us in our product development and our service development, because we can now see what are the customers that are using it, or those that want to use it, worried about. And we can then address that in the product rollout. Or what do they really like? And then we can, again, invest more into that. So, there are different ways to present complex information. It doesn't necessarily just have to be straight to camera for 90 seconds.
So you've given us some great examples of what I might call tactics and formats, but let's just step back a level. How would you help a client build a strategy around video communication in this personality-led environment, particularly if they start off by saying it's not for them?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we all know now video's everywhere. Whether it's Netflix or Amazon Prime or other brands are available as well at home, or whether it's with work, we see it everywhere. And in fact, it's just accelerating with the use of AI as well. So video is everywhere. So if somebody were to come to me, or there was a conversation, at a networking event or wherever, to say, yeah, I get video, but it's not really for me. My counter would probably be, well, it might not be for you, but it's probably for your audience, for your customers. They might like it, but they're not seeing you on video. So is that a missed opportunity? And is there perhaps, what is behind the, it's not for me? You mentioned earlier, if somebody's perhaps not particularly confident, and we spoke about those kind of things. If it's not for them, there's typically something behind that. It's not they dislike a video, because I'm sure they've got a TV at home and they do watch things on YouTube probably. So there's probably a different motivator to say it's not for me. And as I said, it's, in our experience, it's rarely about budget. It's more about other motivations or detractors. So what we would typically then do is we would look at where can video be used appropriately, and where should it be used appropriately. That actually will help in the right moment, on the right channel, create a touch point that we previously didn't have, or that company didn't have previously. And then we would look at how can we visualize something that previously wasn't as well visualized, because again, we're visual learners. Most of us are visual learners, and we certainly our brains react very well to that. So how can we develop something that actually creates a desired outcome from the customers with that visualization through video? So that could be, what is the desired outcome? It could be demand generation, it could be change management, it could be internal communications, whatever it might be with employees. How can we improve that? And then we look at what needs to be communicated in the first place. What are we actually wanting to say, or what are we saying differently without video at the moment? And how is that currently being communicated? And we start seeing where the opportunities are. And then we look at ultimately where we can improve or accelerate that kind of communication. If something works, and there are examples of certain job roles that actually prefer not to watch video. Others prefer video. It just depends a little bit on the nature of the consumer as well. But how can we accelerate the communication? How can we improve the information recall? And how can we motivate a take action? That's ultimately a lot of the outcomes that we want to achieve. So can we communicate something more clearly or more visually that is of benefit? Can we accelerate those outcomes that I mentioned? And ultimately, how can we raise awareness by using video assets as well? And those are kind of it covers a lot of the reasons as to why we might want to do that. And then ultimately, once we've identified that, we will then look at, well, what is the right channel to use to communicate that with that appropriate audience? If it's internal communications, if it's external communications, if it's a specific subgroup of a target audience, and that could be a subgroup either by interest or by age. You mentioned TikTok earlier. If you're addressing an age group that's very young, it's more likely they're going to be there. Then they might be on Facebook, which is now, for us Gen Xers and probably older as well. So we need to look at how we, not just creating the asset, but how actually then distributing that to the audience as well. But it's, as I say, it's rarely that it's not for them. And if it's not for them, it's certainly probably, it is for the audience. That's ultimately why we do it.
So talking outcomes, Lev, how should a fractional or business leader or even their clients measure the actual return on investment of personality-led video content?
I think ultimately we have to appreciate that concept of personality-led video is a mind shift change. It is not a short-term quick fix. We have to achieve this by the end of the quarter, so therefore let's just put out a kind of personality-led video. It is a mind shift change. But then on the flip side of that, if we don't take that approach, then we are remaining, if we still use video, but it's not perhaps personality-led, we are still remaining in a pool of similar type of video, a product demo, a product overview, whatever it might be. And that becomes very hard to differentiate. First, before we want to measure, we have to then decide actually, okay, we are okay with this mind shift change, that this is something that we want to do more of. And it's not going to replace everything. There's still space for these other types of videos as well, but it becomes an important element of your video strategy. And as you can imagine, there are, it might be slightly harsh to call them vanity metrics, but the kind of the view count, they are important, but there's the view count, the kind of number of comments you get, the number of shares you get, and those are important to drive the algorithm of certain video platforms as well. If you don't get those, then you don't get into the next stage of the algorithm pushing you further. So they are important, but they shouldn't be the only way to measure the impact of what you're doing. You want to obviously reach more people, so the follower growth is really important. How many people subscribe to your types of videos and your video channels, but then really you want to be outcome focused. Are we managing to retain customers with that mind shift change? Have we struggled with that before? Are we doing, and again, this doesn't maybe necessarily have to be the fractional leader, but are we doing more to enable our existing customers to succeed by having certain types of video, and therefore they're less likely to churn? Or are we able to accelerate the sales cycle? Are we bringing valuable information at particular stages of the buyer journey that actually helps accelerate that process? And the Ask the Expert was a great example, which sat near the bottom of the funnel, where effectively the folks that were there had a vested interest in wanting to use this. They were very close picking up the phone, talking to sales, but they're not quite ready yet. They just wanted to kind of dot the I's and cross the T's first, make sure that actually, okay, if we're going into this conversation, is this right in the first place? And it's this old by now, but if you think about the kind of the shift of where the sales journey and the marketing journey is, the marketing journey is extended significantly compared to what it used to be, a couple of decades ago, where sales was much more, you had an advert and then sales took over and led most of the conversation. That's obviously flipped around. So that kind of leads into that as well. But then there are other areas or other ways of measuring the success of this is, recognition. Are people recognizing you based on what you've done? You go to a conference, having done this now for half a year. Someone says, "Oh, hey, Charles, I saw your videos." Again, that's great. Lorraine, I saw you on the podcast. I love that one. I love this particular episode. Those kind of things help you evaluate whether it's working as well. Because if people recognize you is one thing, if they say something to you is even better. Because for every person who does say something, there's those people who don't say. And so that's another one. And then if you look at sort of specific, I guess, commercial areas, one is perhaps referrals. I saw, somebody talk about this all the time in this my specific subject area. And, I think there's a lot of conversation around lead generation and how that works, and sales, and how much activity now in terms of finding new vendors, excuse me, actually happens on peer-led WhatsApp groups. People I've worked with, hey, do you know somebody who could be a great fractional FD? Yeah, talk to so-and-so. It doesn't necessarily mean it's on the video, but the video helps build that profile and build that brand. So that next referral is done in that way, based on something that people have seen and that you've influenced with your videos. And then, I guess there's other opportunities that you might get from that, whether it's speaking slots at conferences, or actually new business inquiries based on videos that you shared, or how present you are on certain platforms. So there are different ways of measuring it. It doesn't necessarily just mean that, you look at the view count.
I wanted your opinion on another kind of personality-led video. So I've been working with a guy called Tom Hickmore, who's developed an offer called Drama for Change. And he creates personalities that are acted out in order to bring change within organizations. He created this fictional bus driver who engages in a whole series of different customer service scenarios for Brighton Hove buses, for example. Do you think that it needs to be the real person in the business, or can you create a sort of Ask Sid type character and use that instead?
It's a great question. I think generally it's the easiest to maintain if it's something that reflects your own personality, because you don't have to rehearse that. You don't have to script it. As long as you're comfortable with the recording setup, you could theoretically just turn it on record, and actually, because it's your personality, you're sharing information that you already know, that is your subject matter expertise. So from that perspective, it's much more viable, feasible, and sort of maintainable. That's not to say that this example that you gave wouldn't be useful or appropriate for certain businesses as well, especially if you're acting out certain scenarios, whether it's certain buyer personas or customer personas or things like that. That's very commonplace, and having those on video actually helps visualize that more, rather than having a marketing mark, with a sort of list of 5 attributes of what they're like, or that becomes harder to visualize. So it's a nice idea to have those personalities on video and acting them out, because you can relate to them better in that way. And it comes back to what we said, it's that relatability, that human interaction, that memorability. If you have a workshop and you play that scenario through, and you have that certain personality on video, or perhaps in person acted out, it's more likely you remember that, 5-6 weeks after the workshop or longer, than if you'd read about it on the slide, for sure.
Now, if one of our listeners has asked, how can I maintain a consistent personal brand across video without being repetitive or overly polished?
Yes, good question. I think so there's two elements. One is the overly polished, one is the repetitiveness. The overly polished element is there is an expectation, it's a hygiene factor, there's an expectation that technology is fine today. We don't have to accept bad audio. We don't have to speak into a laptop microphone. We don't have to speak into our even mobile microphone. It is cheap enough to just get a microphone that sounds great. So we shouldn't accept I want it to be authentic because that's just me. No, you just haven't invested £10 in a plug-in microphone. So I think that's one element. The other part around the repeatability, the kind of looking repetitive, just because you might be in a niche scenario somewhere, there is still plenty to talk about. And if you think about different formats we mentioned, whether it's an Ask the Expert, whether it's there is ask ChatGPT for a series of video formats, they'll give you a list of, 10, 20 probably. And then you think about your topics and your topic areas, and you think about it perhaps as a buyer journey or a content journey, kind of how detailed can we go from thought leadership to kind of really practical. And you create a matrix, even just an Excel file, and you have sort of A and B axis and then X and Y axis, and then you start filling out all the different cells within that with topics and video ideas. That's not going to be repetitive because you're talking about different things at different intensity levels and different ways and formats, whether it's a 30-second short or a sort of 2-minute, slightly longer bit, or a 45-minute long form piece. You can create content in a way that isn't repetitive. In fact, if anything, it builds on top of each other. It creates a journey that somebody can journey along with you on, because they say, okay, well, I like this, so let me go into a bit more detail. And also remember that different formats will live on different platforms. You're not going to upload all of that to the same platform. So people actually experience you in different locations, and they probably won't experience you everywhere. And if they do, they clearly like you and they want to see more of you, and then that's a good thing.
Yeah. The other thing, got a friend of mine who said, okay, so I'm an expert on AWS DevOps, highly technical. Will it work for me?
Yes, it's the short answer. Because if it's very niche, typically it means there is fewer competitors and bigger opportunities. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a niche. And if there's fewer opportunities and fewer competitors, it's probably the wrong place to work in. So, there's definitely going to be more opportunities. So, and that means actually it almost becomes easier to dominate that area with good content because there's fewer people doing it. Then the subject matter itself almost doesn't really matter because people are still interested in that knowledge that you have and that insight that you can share. So then ultimately authenticity, value, and I guess the timeliness of that content is more important than the subject matter expertise and whether that is appropriate for that kind of format.
Okay.
Lev, this has been an absolute masterclass in creative, effective communication. If you had one piece of advice for fractional executives and business leaders looking to differentiate themselves through B2B video, what would that be?
Mm-hmm. I think I mentioned it before, make a start and don't be afraid to review yourself, your recordings. It will be really awkward, and even just hearing your voice rather than just even seeing yourself on camera will be horrible if you haven't done it before. So review, learn, adjust, and we said it before, record 20 videos if you want, and then delete them. It's like, writing a letter to somebody that you're really angry with. You write it, you get it out, and then you rip it up and never send it. It's the same thing, right? It's just create those videos and get used to it and get familiar with it and get comfortable with it. But make a start and don't wait for perfectionism, because if you think about it, as much as we'd like to think that any video I upload to YouTube, everyone in the world will see, I can promise you they will not, sadly, because there is gigabytes and terabytes and whatever bytes going up on YouTube every day. And unless you are really at the forefront, the algorithm is not going to push you to everyone. So even if you aren't entirely happy with it and it is your first or second or fifth video and you do upload it because you want to have that exposure, you're still in a safe place because not everybody's going to see it. Now, when you get to the point where everybody will see it, and by that point, the algorithm will have already decided that you're good enough to show it to everybody. So there's no need to fear that. So, but ultimately, be consistent. It is a long-term play, but you do have to get started.
Thank you, Lev. And you give us lots of insights today. I'm sure there are people who'd like to learn more about what you do or would like to work with Made to See. How can they reach you? How can they get in touch?
Well, matetosee.com is our website. You can contact us there. You can find me on LinkedIn as well. I believe I'm the only Lev Cribb in the world. So if you find me there, it's likely me, but there'll be a picture of my face as well. So if you only listen to this on audio, you can find me by name. Otherwise, take a look at the picture. But yeah, I'm more than happy to talk. And we do publish regularly insights on our resources hub as well, which we freely share. So we always are happy to talk, share insights like this, because ultimately it helps everybody improve. And if that means every now and again somebody comes to us and wants to work with us to do that more formally, I'll be more than happy to.
Thanks for tuning in to the Fractional Frontier. If this episode sparked ideas, then don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who needs video strategy with personality. Thanks very much, Lev.
Thank you.